What would you do if you were lying in a frozen trench, both legs shattered, surrounded by nothing but silence and the distant echo of explosions, knowing that no one was coming to save you? What would you do if every breath felt like swallowing shards of glass, and the cold had already begun to claim your fingers, your toes, your hope? Would you pray? Would you scream? Or would you simply close your eyes and wait for the end that seemed so inevitable, so terrifyingly close? Now imagine this. Imagine that in your darkest hour, when every man had abandoned you, when the medics believed you were already dead, when your own commanding officer had written your name on the casualty list, something appeared at your side. Not a man, not a helicopter, not a miracle from the sky, but a dog. A 110-pound American shepherd with eyes the color of burnt copper and a heart that refused to accept what every human mind had already concluded. This is not a fairy tale. This is not Hollywood fiction designed to make you cry into your popcorn. This is the true, documented, classified for decades story of Sergeant First Class Daniel Whitmore and the military working dog, known only by his operational designation, Kaiser 7. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from, what city, what state, what country. I want to know who is here, who is listening, who is ready to hear the story that the United States Army did not want you to know for over 40 years. And if you have not already, please subscribe to this channel. We need your help. Every subscription, every like, every share helps us continue bringing you these hidden stories, these classified truths, these moments of impossible heroism that the world tried to bury. Hit that subscribe button. Do it now, because what you are about to hear will change the way you see war, courage, and the bond between man and animal forever. The winter of 1951 was one of the coldest on record in the Korean Peninsula. American soldiers stationed near the Chosin Reservoir had already endured temperatures that plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Frostbite claimed more casualties than enemy fire in some units. Men would wake up to find their boots frozen to their feet, their canteens solid blocks of ice, their weapons so cold that touching the bare metal would strip the skin clean off their palms. Sergeant First Class Daniel Whitmore was a 26-year-old farm boy from rural Tennessee. He had grown up in a small town called Hartsville, about 50 miles northeast of Nashville, where his father raised cattle and his mother taught Sunday school at the First Baptist Church. Daniel had enlisted in 1948, seeking adventure, seeking purpose, seeking something beyond the endless fields of his childhood. He found it in the Army, and the Army found in him a natural leader, a man whose calm demeanor and steady hands made him invaluable under fire. By November of 1951, Daniel had already earned a Bronze Star for his actions during the Battle of Bloody Ridge. He was respected by his men, trusted by his officers, and feared by the enemy. But none of that would matter on the night of November 23rd, when a Chinese mortar round landed 3 feet from his position and turned his world into fire and darkness. The explosion killed 2 men instantly. Private First Class Robert Hensley, 19 years old, from Mobile, Alabama. Corporal James Dutton, 22 years old, from Portland, Oregon. Good men, young men, men who would never see their families again. Daniel was thrown 15 feet through the air, his body slamming into the frozen ground with a force that shattered his left femur and fractured his right tibia in 3 places. Shrapnel tore through his lower back, severing muscle and nicking his spine in a way that would leave him paralyzed from the waist down for the next 16 hours. When he regained consciousness, Daniel could not feel his legs. He could not move. He could only see the grey sky above him, heavy with clouds that promised more snow, and hear the sounds of battle fading into the distance as his unit was forced to retreat under overwhelming enemy pressure. They left him behind, not out of malice, not out of cowardice. The retreat was chaotic, desperate, a matter of survival against a Chinese force that outnumbered them nearly 8 to 1. In the confusion, in the smoke and screaming and thunder of artillery, Daniel Whitmore was marked as killed in action. His dog tags were collected by a corporal who swore he had checked for a pulse and found none. The official report, filed 3 days later, listed Sergeant First Class Daniel Whitmore as deceased, body unrecovered due to enemy activity in the area. But Daniel was not dead. He was lying in a shell crater, his blood freezing against the snow, his consciousness flickering like a candle in a hurricane. He tried to call out, but his voice was a whisper lost in the wind. He tried to crawl, but his legs would not respond to any command his brain could muster. The cold was seeping into his bones, into his organs, into his very soul. He knew, with the terrible clarity that comes only in moments of true extremity, that he was going to die in this frozen hellscape, alone, forgotten, 10,000 miles from the green hills of Tennessee. That was when he heard the footsteps. Not human footsteps. Something lighter, something faster, something approaching through the snow with a determination that seemed almost supernatural. Daniel turned his head, using what little strength remained in his neck, and saw a shape emerging from the swirling white. Large, powerful, moving with purpose. Kaiser 7 had been deployed with the 31st Infantry Regiment as part of an experimental military working dog program that most soldiers knew nothing about. The program had begun in 1942, during the height of World War II, when the Army realized that dogs could be trained for tasks that no human could perform as effectively: sentry duty, messenger runs, scout patrols, search and rescue. Kaiser was an American shepherd, bred specifically for military service at a facility in Fort Benning, Georgia. His training had been intense, comprehensive, and classified at the highest levels. He could track a human scent across miles of wilderness. He could detect enemy movement before any soldier could see or hear it. He could carry messages through active combat zones. And he had been trained, through methods that remain controversial to this day, to retrieve wounded soldiers from the battlefield. The bond between Kaiser and his handler, Corporal Thomas Brennan, had been forged through 18 months of training and 6 months of combat deployment. They were inseparable. They communicated through gestures, through sounds, through a connection that transcended language. When Corporal Brennan was killed by a sniper on November 20th, just 3 days before the mortar attack that wounded Daniel, Kaiser had refused to leave his handler's body for nearly 6 hours. It took 4 soldiers to physically drag the dog away. Since then, Kaiser had been assigned to no one. He wandered the camp like a ghost, eating little, sleeping less, his eyes carrying a grief that every soldier recognized but none could address. The veterinary officer had recommended that Kaiser be shipped back to the States, citing psychological trauma that made him unfit for further service. The paperwork was being processed when the Chinese offensive began. No one knows exactly how Kaiser found Daniel Whitmore in that shell crater. The distance between the forward operating base and Daniel's position was nearly 10 kilometers of frozen, enemy-controlled territory. The terrain was treacherous, filled with hidden crevasses, unexploded ordnance, and Chinese patrols that shot anything that moved. The odds of any living creature making that journey in those conditions without being detected or killed were astronomically small. But Kaiser made it. Daniel would later describe the moment he saw the dog's face hovering above him as the most profound spiritual experience of his life. The animal's breath was warm against his frozen skin. The dog's eyes, those remarkable copper-colored eyes, seemed to hold an intelligence, a compassion, a determination that Daniel had never seen in any creature, human or otherwise. Kaiser did not bark. He did not whimper. He simply assessed the situation with a calm efficiency that would have impressed the most seasoned combat medic. The dog circled Daniel twice, sniffing, examining, understanding. Then Kaiser did something that no amount of training could have prepared anyone for. He began to dig. Using his powerful front paws, Kaiser cleared the snow from around Daniel's upper body. He pushed aside debris with his muzzle. He worked with a focused intensity that seemed impossible for an animal operating without human direction. And when Daniel's torso was sufficiently exposed, Kaiser positioned himself alongside the wounded soldier and took hold of Daniel's jacket collar with his teeth. The fabric was thick, designed to withstand the brutal Korean winter. Kaiser's grip was secure, his jaw locked with a strength that could crush bone if applied differently. And then, with a determination that defied every law of nature and reason, Kaiser began to pull. The first meter was agony. Daniel screamed as his shattered legs dragged across the frozen ground, the bones grinding against each other in ways that sent white-hot bolts of pain shooting through his nervous system. He begged the dog to stop. He cursed, he prayed, he wept, but Kaiser did not stop. The dog continued to pull, inch by inch, foot by foot, dragging the 180-pound soldier through the snow with a relentless, unstoppable persistence. They moved through the night. The temperature continued to drop. Daniel slipped in and out of consciousness, his body shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature and vital organ operation. Every time he woke, Kaiser was still there, still pulling, still moving toward a destination that the dog somehow knew and the man could not fathom. At one point they encountered a Chinese patrol. 3 soldiers, moving through the darkness with rifles at the ready. Daniel was certain they were dead. He tried to tell Kaiser to run, to save himself, but the dog seemed to understand the danger on his own. Kaiser released Daniel's collar and pushed the sergeant into a snowdrift, covering him with his own body. The 2 of them lay motionless, buried in white, as the patrol passed within 20 feet of their position. The soldiers never saw them. Whether it was the snow, the darkness, or some intervention that transcended human understanding, the patrol continued on, disappearing into the frozen landscape. Kaiser waited nearly 30 minutes before resuming his mission, his ears tracking the sounds around them, his nose constantly testing the air for threats. By dawn, Daniel could no longer feel anything below his chest. The cold had won the battle for his extremities. His fingers were waxy and white, the early stages of severe frostbite that would eventually cost him 3 fingers on his left hand. His face was a mask of frozen tears and crystallized mucus. He had stopped praying hours ago, stopped begging, stopped hoping. He had resigned himself to death and was simply waiting for it to claim him. But Kaiser had not resigned himself to anything. The dog continued to pull, through ravines, across frozen streams, up hills that seemed impossible for a single animal to climb, while dragging the weight of a full-grown man. Kaiser's paws were bleeding by this point, the constant friction against ice and rock having worn through his pads and into the tender flesh beneath. But the dog did not stop. He could not stop. Something inside that animal, something that went beyond training, beyond instinct, beyond anything science could explain, refused to accept failure. At approximately 0700 hours on November 24, 1951, Private First Class Eugene Martinez was standing guard at the perimeter of the forward medical station when he saw something moving in the distance. His first instinct was to raise his rifle. His second instinct was to call for backup. But something made him wait, made him watch, made him squint through the early morning light at the strange shape approaching through the snow. It was a dog, a large shepherd, moving slowly, laboriously, dragging something behind it. Martinez lowered his rifle and began to walk toward the animal, his curiosity overcoming his caution. As he got closer, he realized what the dog was dragging. It was a man, an American soldier, alive. Private Martinez would later testify that he fell to his knees and wept when he recognized the sergeant's stripes on the frozen uniform. He screamed for medics. He screamed for officers. He screamed for anyone who could help him understand what he was witnessing, this impossible miracle playing out before his eyes. Kaiser had done it. 10 kilometers of frozen hell, enemy territory, sub-zero temperatures, patrols, terrain that would have challenged a healthy soldier on foot. And the dog had done it, dragging a paralyzed man the entire way, refusing to stop, refusing to fail, refusing to let death claim another soldier. When the medics arrived, they had to pry Daniel Whitmore's jacket from Kaiser's jaws. The dog would not release his grip. His mouth was bleeding. His teeth cracked from the hours of sustained pressure, but he would not let go until 3 men physically restrained him, and a veterinary officer sedated him with a dose of medication normally reserved for much larger animals. Daniel was rushed into surgery. The doctors did not expect him to survive. His core temperature had dropped to 84 degrees, nearly 10 degrees below the threshold for severe hypothermia. His legs were a ruin of shattered bone and frozen tissue. His spinal injury, while not permanent, had caused significant nerve damage that would require months of rehabilitation. But Daniel survived. Against every medical prediction, against every statistical probability, against every odd that the universe could stack against him, Sergeant First Class Daniel Whitmore survived, and when he woke up 3 days later in a military hospital in Tokyo, the first word he spoke was a name: Kaiser. The story of what happened next, of the bond that formed between the saved and the savior, of the military's attempts to classify and suppress this remarkable tale, of the decades of secrecy that followed, and of the final, heartbreaking chapter that would not unfold until 1993, when a dying man made a deathbed confession that revealed the full truth of November 1951. All of that is still to come. But for now, understand this. Understand that in the darkest moment of one man's life, when every human being had given up, when every system had failed, when hope itself had frozen and died in that Korean winter, a dog refused to quit. A dog, trained by human hands, but driven by something far beyond human understanding, crossed the impossible divide and brought a dead man back to life. The military did not want this story told. The documents remained classified until 2003. The witnesses were ordered to never speak of what they had seen, but the truth, like Kaiser himself, could not be stopped. It could not be silenced. It could not be buried in the snow of forgotten history. Kaiser 7 was not just a dog. He was a testament to a bond between species that we are only beginning to understand. He was proof that courage, loyalty, and love are not unique to humanity. And he was, in the words of Sergeant First Class Daniel Whitmore, spoken at his retirement ceremony in 1972, the reason I believe in God. Because only God could have sent me that angel with 4 legs and a heart bigger than any man I ever knew. The medical team at the forward station worked through the day and into the following night to stabilize Daniel Whitmore. His condition fluctuated wildly, his vital signs crashing and recovering with a rhythm that kept the doctors in a constant state of alert. Twice they lost his heartbeat. Twice they brought him back with chest compressions and sheer willpower. Meanwhile, Kaiser was being treated in a separate tent, his wounds cleaned and bandaged by veterinary staff who were equally amazed and disturbed by what they were witnessing. The dog's paws were raw, the pads worn completely through in several places, exposing muscle and bone that should have made walking, let alone pulling a grown man for 10 kilometers, absolutely impossible. His jaw showed stress fractures from the sustained grip on Daniel's jacket. His body temperature, while not as dangerously low as his human cargo, was significantly below normal. But what struck the veterinary team most was the dog's behavior. Kaiser would not rest. Despite sedation, despite exhaustion, despite injuries that would have incapacitated most animals, the shepherd kept trying to stand. Kept trying to move toward the surgical tent where Daniel was being operated on. It was as if the dog understood, on some fundamental level, that his mission was not yet complete. Captain Harold Stevens, the commanding officer of the medical station, would later write in his personal journal an entry that remained hidden until his death in 1989. I have seen many things in this war. I've seen men commit acts of extraordinary bravery and unspeakable cruelty. I've seen the best and worst of human nature laid bare in the crucible of combat. But I have never seen anything like what I witnessed today. A dog, a simple animal that we trained to follow commands and perform tricks, traveled alone through enemy territory in conditions that would kill most men. Dragging a wounded soldier who outweighed him by 70 pounds. The dog's handler has been dead for 4 days. No one gave this animal an order. No one directed him to that shell crater. No one taught him to lie still while enemy patrols passed within spitting distance. This was not training. This was something else. Something I do not have the vocabulary to describe. Something that makes me question everything I thought I knew about the world and its creatures. The news of Kaiser's feat spread through the military command structure with remarkable speed, considering the chaotic conditions of the Korean conflict. By November 26th, General Matthew Ridgway himself had been briefed on the incident. The response from High Command was immediate and, from the perspective of those who witnessed it, deeply troubling. A classification order was issued within 48 hours. All personnel who had witnessed Kaiser's arrival at the medical station were instructed to sign non-disclosure agreements. The official incident report was rewritten to attribute Daniel's rescue to a 2-man patrol that had discovered him during a routine reconnaissance mission. Kaiser's involvement was erased from every document, every record, every official account of the events of November 1951. The reasons for this suppression were never explicitly stated, but those who were close to the decision-making process had theories. Some believed the military was concerned about the propaganda implications, the possibility that the enemy could use the story to mock American soldiers as so weak they needed dogs to save them. Others suggested the classification was related to the experimental nature of the military working dog program, which had produced other results that the army did not want made public. Still others whispered about something darker, something related to the methods used to train dogs like Kaiser, methods that violated conventions and standards that the American military publicly claimed to uphold. Whatever the reason, the truth was buried. Daniel Whitmore was listed as rescued by friendly forces. Kaiser 7 was listed as killed in action on November 23, 1951, the same day his handler died. The official records showed the dog being buried in a mass grave with other military working dogs that had perished in the conflict. But Kaiser was not dead, and neither was the bond between him and the man whose life he had saved. Daniel's recovery was long and painful. He spent 4 months in the Tokyo military hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries to repair his shattered legs. The doctors told him he would never walk again. They told him the nerve damage was too severe, the bone reconstruction too compromised. They told him to prepare for a life in a wheelchair. Daniel did not accept this prognosis. He could not accept it, because every night, in his dreams, he saw Kaiser's face. He felt the dog's warm breath on his frozen skin. He heard the soft, determined grunts of the shepherd as he pulled his burden through the snow. And every morning, Daniel woke with a single thought burning in his mind. If that dog could do the impossible for me, I can do the impossible for myself. The rehabilitation was brutal. Daniel pushed himself beyond every limit his doctors set, beyond every boundary his broken body tried to impose. He fell. He failed. He wept with frustration and pain and exhaustion. But he never quit. He never stopped. He channeled the spirit of the dog who had saved him into every agonizing step of his recovery. By March of 1952, Daniel Whitmore took his first unassisted steps since the mortar attack. The nurses cried. The doctors shook their heads in disbelief. The chaplain quoted scripture about miracles and divine intervention. But Daniel knew the truth. It was not a miracle. It was not divine intervention, at least not in the way the chaplain meant it. It was a dog who had refused to let him die. A dog who had shown him what true courage, true determination, true love looked like, and Daniel was determined to honor that gift for the rest of his life. He was discharged from military service in June of 1952 with full honors, though the honors were based on a falsified record that mentioned nothing about Kaiser 7. He returned to Tennessee, to the farm in Hartsville, to the rolling green hills that had never seemed so beautiful, so precious, so worthy of the sacrifice that had been made to allow him to see them again. But Daniel could not forget. He could not move on. He could not pretend that the official story was true, that some anonymous patrol had found him, that the dog who saved his life had died alongside his handler in an unmarked grave. He began to search, quietly at first, asking questions of other veterans, writing letters to military contacts, digging through whatever records he could access. The responses he received were uniformly discouraging. There was no record of a dog named Kaiser 7. There was no documentation of the experimental program. There was no evidence that his rescue had occurred in any way other than what the official reports described. But Daniel persisted, because he knew. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had felt. He knew that somewhere, somehow, that dog was still alive, and he would not rest until he found him. The breakthrough came in 1954, 2 years after Daniel's discharge. A former Army veterinarian named Dr. Charles Hendricks contacted him through a mutual acquaintance. Dr. Hendricks had served at the Forward Medical Station where Daniel had been treated. He had been one of the men who treated Kaiser's wounds, and he had information that would change everything. Kaiser 7 was not dead. The dog had been shipped back to the United States in December of 1951, officially listed as a training asset being returned to Fort Benning for evaluation. But Kaiser had never arrived at Fort Benning. Somewhere between the port of San Francisco and the military installation in Georgia, the dog had disappeared. Dr. Hendricks believed he knew where Kaiser had gone. During his time treating the shepherd, he had overheard conversations between military intelligence officers. They spoke of a facility, a research center, a place where animals that had demonstrated extraordinary capabilities were taken for study. The location was never named, but Dr. Hendricks remembered one detail that had stuck with him through the years. One of the officers had mentioned a small town in New Mexico near a military installation that officially did not exist. The town was called Coyote Springs. Daniel Whitmore had a new mission, and nothing, not the military, not the government, not the passage of time, would stop him from completing it. Daniel Whitmore arrived in New Mexico in the spring of 1955. He had sold a portion of his family's farmland to finance the journey, a decision that caused a rift with his father that would never fully heal. But Daniel did not care about the land. He did not care about the money. He did not care about the whispered accusations of madness that followed him from Tennessee to the dusty roads of the American Southwest. He cared only about Kaiser. Coyote Springs was not on any official map. Daniel spent 3 weeks in Albuquerque, asking questions at diners and gas stations and churches, showing a photograph of Kaiser that Dr. Hendricks had secretly taken at the medical station before the dog was shipped away. Most people shook their heads. They had never heard of Coyote Springs. They had never seen a dog like that. They suggested, with varying degrees of politeness, that Daniel might benefit from speaking with a doctor about his mental state. But on the 23rd day of his search, Daniel walked into a bar on the outskirts of Santa Fe and showed the photograph to a bartender named Ernesto Vega. The man's face changed. The color drained from his weathered skin. His hands, which had been wiping a glass with practiced ease, suddenly trembled. "You need to leave," Ernesto said. "You need to forget about that place. You need to go back to wherever you came from and never speak of this again." Daniel did not leave. He sat on that bar stool for 6 hours, ordering drinks he did not touch, waiting for the bar to empty. When the last customer stumbled out into the desert night, Ernesto locked the door and sat down across from the man who would not be dissuaded. My brother worked there, Ernesto said. His voice was barely a whisper, as if he feared the walls themselves were listening. He was a janitor, nothing important, just a man with a mop and a bucket, but he saw things that gave him nightmares until the day he died. The facility was called Site 14. It was located approximately 40 miles northeast of Los Alamos, hidden in a valley that was surrounded by mountains on 3 sides and accessible only by a single road that was guarded 24 hours a day. Officially, it did not exist. There were no records, no paperwork, no evidence that the United States government had ever built anything in that remote corner of New Mexico. But Ernesto's brother, a man named Gabriel, had worked there from 1952 until 1954. He had signed documents that threatened imprisonment for life if he ever spoke of what he witnessed. He had been paid triple the standard government wage for his silence, and he had carried the weight of that silence to his grave, dying of a heart attack in 1953 at the age of 39. They were studying the dogs, Ernesto said, but not like you study an animal in a laboratory. They were studying them like you study an enemy, like you study a weapon. They wanted to know how Kaiser did what he did. They wanted to replicate it. They wanted to create an army of dogs that could do the impossible. Daniel listened as Ernesto described what his brother had witnessed. The facility housed approximately 30 dogs, all of them military working animals that had demonstrated extraordinary capabilities during combat deployment. Some had tracked enemies across impossible distances. Some had detected mines and explosives with uncanny accuracy. Some had performed rescues that defied explanation. Kaiser 7 was among them. Gabriel had seen the shepherd in a kennel on the 3rd floor of the main building. The dog was different from the others, Gabriel had said. The other dogs barked, they paced, they showed signs of stress and confusion. But Kaiser simply sat in the corner of his cell, his copper eyes fixed on the door, waiting for someone, Gabriel had believed, waiting for the man who never came. The experiments conducted at Site 14 were never fully documented in any record that survived the facility's eventual closure. But Gabriel had seen enough to piece together a disturbing picture. The scientists were not simply studying the dogs, they were testing them, pushing them to the limits of endurance, of pain, of psychological stress. They wanted to understand what made these animals capable of feats that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of canine behavior. Some dogs did not survive the testing. Gabriel had been responsible for removing the bodies, loading them into a truck that drove away in the middle of the night and returned empty by morning. He never knew where the bodies went. He never asked. He simply did his job and tried not to think about the sounds he heard coming from the laboratories after dark. But Kaiser survived. Whatever they did to that dog, however they tested him, Kaiser endured. Gabriel had told Ernesto that the shepherd seemed to grow stronger with each trial, as if the suffering was fuel for something burning deep inside the animal's soul. "I do not know if the dog is still there," Ernesto said. "My brother died over a year ago. The facility might be closed, the dog might be dead, but if you are determined to find out, I can tell you how to reach the valley. After that, you are on your own, and may God have mercy on your soul." Daniel left Santa Fe the following morning with a hand-drawn map and a heart full of desperate hope. The journey to the valley took 3 days. The roads were unpaved, treacherous, often indistinguishable from the rocky desert terrain that surrounded them. His truck broke down twice. He ran out of water once and had to hike 6 miles to a stream that was little more than a trickle of muddy liquid. But he did not stop. He could not stop, because with every mile that passed, Daniel felt something growing stronger inside him, a connection, a pull, a sense that he was drawing closer to something that had been waiting for him since that frozen night in Korea when a dog had appeared from the snow and refused to let him die. He reached the valley on the 4th day. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for a place of such darkness. Daniel parked his truck behind a cluster of boulders and approached the facility on foot. using the fading light and the long shadows to conceal his movement. Site 14 was smaller than he had expected, a cluster of low buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Guard towers at each corner, though only one appeared to be manned. The American flag flew from a pole near the main entrance, snapping in the desert wind with a sound like distant gunfire. Daniel watched the facility for 2 hours, memorizing patrol patterns, identifying blind spots, formulating a plan that was equal parts strategy and desperation. He had no weapons. He had no backup. He had nothing but his determination and the memory of a dog's warm breath on his frozen face. At 2200 hours, he made his move. The fence was easier to breach than he expected. A section near the rear of the compound had been damaged, possibly by weather, possibly by wildlife, and the guards had not yet repaired it. Daniel squeezed through the gap, tearing his shirt and leaving skin on the twisted metal, but he did not feel the pain. He was focused entirely on the building ahead of him, the 3-story structure that Ernesto had described, the place where Kaiser was held. The building was dark. No lights shone from the windows. No sounds emerged from within. For a terrible moment, Daniel wondered if he was too late, if the facility had been abandoned, if Kaiser had been moved or destroyed, or simply forgotten in some government bureaucracy that treated extraordinary animals as nothing more than line items in a budget. But then he heard it. A sound, faint, distant, coming from somewhere inside the building, barking. Not the frantic barking of an alarmed animal. Something different, something purposeful, something that sounded almost like a greeting. Daniel found a door on the ground floor that had been left unlocked. He slipped inside, his eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness, his other senses straining to gather information. The air smelled of chemicals and antiseptic and something else, something organic and disturbing that he could not identify. He moved through corridors lined with doors that bore no markings. He climbed stairs that creaked beneath his weight, each sound seeming to echo through the empty building like a thunderclap. He reached the 3rd floor and began checking rooms, one by one, finding empty cages and abandoned equipment and walls covered with charts and diagrams that he could not understand in the darkness. And then he found him, the last room at the end of the hall. A cell with bars instead of walls, a concrete floor with a drain in the center, a water bowl empty, a food dish empty, and in the corner, lying on a thin blanket that was the only comfort in that sterile prison, a dog, Kaiser. The shepherd's head lifted as Daniel approached, those copper eyes, dimmed by time and suffering, but still unmistakable, fixed on the man who stood before the bars. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. The universe seemed to contract to this single point in space and time, this reunion that had been written in the stars since the night a dog had refused to let a soldier die. Then Kaiser stood, slowly, painfully. His body was thinner than Daniel remembered, his coat dull and patchy, his movements stiff with age and injury. But he stood, and he walked to the bars, and he pressed his muzzle through the gap, his breath warm against Daniel's outstretched hand. "I found you," Daniel whispered. "I found you, boy. I am here." The lock on the cell was simple, a padlock that yielded to a rock Daniel found in the corner of the room. The door swung open with a screech of rusted hinges. And for the first time since that frozen night in Korea, Daniel Whitmore and Kaiser 7 were together again. Daniel fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. He wept with a depth and intensity that he had not known he was capable of. Tears flowing down his face and soaking into Kaiser's matted fur. The dog did not pull away. He leaned into the embrace, his tail moving slowly, weakly, but moving nonetheless. They stayed like that for what felt like hours. Two souls reunited across time and distance and every obstacle that fate and government and war had placed between them. Two hearts beating together in the darkness of a place that had tried to destroy them both. But the reunion could not last forever. Daniel knew they had to move, had to escape, had to get as far from this place as possible before anyone discovered what had happened. He helped Kaiser to his feet and guided the dog toward the door. The shepherd was weak, his legs unsteady, but he walked. He walked with the same determination that had carried him across 10 kilometers of frozen hell. He walked because that was what Kaiser 7 did. He walked because giving up was not in his nature. They made it out of the building. They made it through the hole in the fence. They made it to Daniel's truck, where Daniel lifted Kaiser into the passenger seat with hands that trembled from emotion and exertion. And then they drove. They drove through the night, putting as many miles as possible between themselves and Site 14. Daniel did not know if anyone would pursue them. He did not know if the military would send men to retrieve their stolen property. He did not care. He had Kaiser. Nothing else mattered. They crossed into Texas as the sun rose over the eastern horizon. Daniel pulled into a rest stop and bought water and food from a vending machine, feeding Kaiser by hand, watching the dog eat with an appetite that suggested he had been starved for weeks. "We are going home," Daniel said. "We are going home, and you are never going to be alone again. I promise you, Kaiser. I promise you on my life." The journey back to Tennessee took 5 days. Daniel drove slowly, stopping frequently to let Kaiser rest and eat and drink. He found a veterinarian in Oklahoma City who agreed to examine the dog without asking too many questions. The vet's diagnosis was grim. Kaiser was suffering from malnutrition, chronic infections, and what appeared to be the long-term effects of repeated sedation. His heart was weak, his kidneys were damaged. His life expectancy, the vet said gently, was measured in months, not years. Daniel did not accept this prognosis. He had not accepted the prognosis for his own recovery, and he would not accept it for the dog who had given him that recovery. He took Kaiser home to the farm in Hartsville. He built a bed for the dog next to his own, filling it with the softest blankets he could find. He cooked meals by hand, mixing meat and vegetables and supplements that the vet recommended. He spent every waking moment at Kaiser's side, talking to the dog, reading to him, playing music that seemed to calm the shepherd's troubled spirit. The months passed. Spring turned to summer. Summer turned to fall. And Kaiser 7, the dog who should have died in Korea, the dog who should have died at Site 14, the dog who the veterinarian said had months at most, continued to live. He grew stronger. His coat regained its luster. His appetite returned with vigor. His eyes, those remarkable copper eyes, began to shine again with the intelligence and warmth that Daniel remembered from that frozen night when the world had ended and begun again. The local people of Hartsville did not know the full story. They knew only that Daniel Whitmore had returned from the war with a dog, a large shepherd that followed him everywhere, that slept at his feet during church services, that seemed to understand human speech with an uncanny precision. They whispered about the bond between the man and the animal. They told stories to their children about the soldier and his faithful companion. They did not know about Korea. They did not know about the rescue. They did not know about the facility in New Mexico and the dark experiments that had tried to break what could not be broken. And Daniel never told them. He kept the secret, as he had been forced to keep it, locked away in his heart, alongside the gratitude and the love and the wonder that he felt every time he looked at Kaiser. They had 7 years together, 7 years of walks through the Tennessee hills, 7 years of quiet evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over the green fields. 7 years of a friendship that transcended species, that defied explanation, that proved beyond any doubt that the bond between human and animal was something sacred, something divine. Kaiser 7 died on October 14th, 1962. He passed peacefully in his sleep on the bed that Daniel had built for him, with his head resting on Daniel's lap. There was no pain, there was no struggle. There was only a soft exhalation, a gentle cessation, a soul departing for whatever reward awaited those who had loved so completely and served so faithfully. Daniel buried Kaiser on a hill overlooking the farm. He carved a headstone himself, working for 3 days with tools that blistered his hands and broke his heart. The inscription was simple: Kaiser 7. He carried me when I could not walk. He loved me when I could not love myself. He showed me what courage looks like. Until we meet again. Daniel Whitmore lived for another 31 years after Kaiser's death. He never married. He never had children. He said to those who asked that he had already experienced the deepest love of his life, and nothing could compare. He continued to search for information about Site 14, about the military working dog program, about the experiments that had been conducted in that hidden valley in New Mexico. He wrote letters to congressmen. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests. He contacted journalists and historians and anyone who might help him expose the truth. But the walls of secrecy held firm. Every inquiry was met with denials. Every request was rejected. Every avenue led to a dead end. The government had buried the truth deep, and it showed no signs of ever letting it surface. Until 1993. Daniel was 70 years old when he received a phone call from a hospital in San Diego. A man was dying. A man named Colonel Richard Ashworth, retired, former commanding officer of a facility that officially did not exist. The colonel had asked to speak with Daniel Whitmore before he died. He had something to confess. Daniel flew to California the next day. He found Colonel Ashworth in a private room, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with the rhythm of a life approaching its end. The colonel was 84 years old, a skeleton wrapped in paper-thin skin, but his eyes were clear, and his voice, though weak, was steady. "I commanded Site 14 from 1952 to 1958, the colonel said. "I oversaw the research. I approved the experiments. I signed the orders that kept those dogs in cages, that subjected them to tests that no living creature should endure. I did it because I was ordered to. I did it because I believed it was necessary for national security. I did it because I was a coward who valued his career more than his conscience." Daniel sat in silence as the dying man spoke. He learned things that he had suspected but never confirmed. The military had been trying to understand the source of Kaiser's extraordinary behavior, the drive that had allowed him to accomplish what should have been impossible. They had theorized that certain dogs possessed a neurological mutation, a variation in brain structure that enhanced their capacity for loyalty, determination, and what the scientists called goal-directed persistence. The experiments were designed to identify this mutation, to isolate it, to replicate it. The goal was to create a breeding program that would produce dogs with enhanced capabilities, animals that could be deployed in combat situations where human soldiers could not survive. But the experiments failed. No matter how many dogs they tested, no matter how many procedures they performed, they could not find the source of what made Kaiser 7 special. The scientists concluded eventually that there was no mutation. There was no neurological variation. There was nothing in Kaiser's brain or body that explained what he had done. The colonel paused, his breath rattling in his chest. "Do you know what the final report said?" he asked. "The report that was classified at the highest level and locked away in a vault that I doubt has ever been opened." Daniel shook his head. "It said that the phenomenon observed in subject K7 could not be explained by any known biological or psychological mechanism. It said that the subject appeared to be motivated by something that transcended the normal parameters of animal behavior. It said, and I remember the exact words because they have haunted me for 40 years, the subject's actions suggest the presence of a factor that science cannot measure and cannot replicate. We recommend that this factor be designated as outside the scope of military research." The colonel closed his eyes. "They could not explain it," he whispered. "The best scientists in the country, with unlimited resources and no ethical constraints, could not explain why that dog did what he did. So they gave up. They closed the facility. They destroyed the records. They scattered the remaining dogs to shelters across the country under false identities. and they tried to pretend that none of it had ever happened. Daniel asked the question that had burned in his heart for 4 decades. Why? Why did Kaiser do it? Why did he come for me? The colonel opened his eyes. For a moment, something flickered in those dying orbs. Something that might have been wonder. Something that might have been faith. I spent my career in service of a government that believed everything could be explained, he said. Everything could be measured. Everything could be controlled. But I know now, at the end of my life, that there are forces in this world that transcend our understanding. There are bonds that cannot be broken. There is love that cannot be quantified. And there is, whether you call it God or fate, or simply the mystery of existence, something that watches over us in our darkest hours. The colonel reached out and took Daniel's hand. That dog loved you, he said. Not because he was trained to, not because of some mutation in his brain. He loved you because love is real, and it does not obey the laws of science. He came for you because he could not do otherwise, because leaving you to die would have been a betrayal of everything he was. And that, Mr. Whitmore, is something that no government will ever be able to replicate. Colonel Richard Ashworth died 3 hours later. Daniel was still holding his hand. The story of Kaiser 7 was never officially acknowledged by the United States government. The documents from Site 14, if they still exist, remain classified. The witnesses have all died. The evidence has been buried under decades of secrecy and denial. But the truth cannot be hidden forever. It lives in the memories of those who were there. It echoes in the stories passed down through generations. It survives in the hearts of everyone who has ever loved a dog and wondered if that love was truly returned. Daniel Whitmore died in 2004 at the age of 81. He was buried on the hill in Hartsville, next to the grave of Kaiser 7. His headstone bears an inscription that he wrote himself in the final months of his life, when he knew that the end was approaching, and he wanted to leave behind a message for anyone who might find his grave. The inscription reads, "Here lies a man who was saved by a dog, not just his life, but his soul. In the darkest hour when all hope was gone, an angel with 4 legs and copper eyes appeared from the snow and refused to let death win. To Kaiser 7, my friend, my savior, my proof that God exists and that his love takes many forms. Wait for me, boy. I am coming home." Some say that on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind carries the scent of distant snow, you can hear something on that hill in Tennessee. Not the howling of wolves, not the barking of farm dogs. Something different, something softer, something that sounds almost like 2 hearts beating together in the darkness. The military working dog program continues to this day. Dogs are deployed in combat zones around the world, performing tasks that would be impossible for human soldiers. They are trained with methods that have evolved over decades, methods that are more humane, more scientific, more effective than anything used at Site 14. But every now and then, a dog does something that defies explanation. A dog travels impossible distances. A dog performs impossible rescues. A dog shows a loyalty and courage that transcends every boundary of training and instinct and biology. And when that happens, there are those who remember Kaiser 7. There are those who know that some things cannot be explained. There are those who believe that the love between a human and a dog is not just real, but sacred. If you are watching this, if you have stayed until the end, I want you to think about what you have just heard. Think about a dog who refused to quit. Think about a man who refused to forget. Think about the bond between them that survived war and government and time itself. And then ask yourself this question: do you believe? In a world that tries to explain everything, that measures and quantifies and reduces the miraculous to the mundane, do you still believe that there are forces beyond our understanding? Do you still believe in love that transcends species? Do you still believe in courage that defies logic? Do you still believe in the God who sends angels in unexpected forms? Because Kaiser 7 believed. He believed in a man he had never met, a soldier lying in a frozen crater, a human being who needed help that no other human being could provide. And that belief, that pure and unconditional faith, carried him across 10 kilometers of impossible terrain and into the pages of history. In these dark times, when the world seems filled with hatred and division and despair, we need to remember stories like this one. We need to remember that love is real, that courage is real, that the bond between souls, whether human or animal, is the most powerful force in the universe. And we need to remember God. We need to remember Jesus Christ. We need to remember that we are never truly alone, that even in our darkest hours, there is someone watching over us, someone who sends help when we need it most, someone who loves us with a love that transcends all understanding. Turn to Him, open your heart, let His light into your life, because the same God who sent Kaiser 7 to save Daniel Whitmore wants to save you too. He wants to carry you when you cannot walk. He wants to love you when you cannot love yourself. He wants to show you what courage looks like. All you have to do is believe. And if you ever doubt, if you ever wonder, if you ever question whether any of this is real, just remember, a dog walked 10 kilometers through frozen hell to save a stranger. If that is not a miracle, nothing is. May God bless you. May He watch over you. And may you find in the darkest moments of your life an angel with 4 legs and eyes the color of burnt copper waiting to carry you home. The end. But perhaps somewhere out there, the story continues. Perhaps there are other dogs, other soldiers, other miracles waiting to happen. Perhaps the legacy of Kaiser 7 lives on in every military working dog that deploys today, in every bond between handler and animal, in every act of impossible courage that the world tries to explain and fails. Keep watching, keep believing, keep your eyes open for the angels among us. They are closer than you think.